I was knee-deep in a trough of feed when I heard it, the buzzing. Not the kind that comes from a bee or even a mosquito, but the mechanical, nosy hum of something man-made. I looked up, and there it was, hovering like some kind of floating tattletale. Karen's new drone. It zipped in low over the horses, spooking them bad enough that Daisy, my mare, bucked and knocked over a whole stack of hay bales. I hadn't even had my coffee yet, and already I was on edge. It was the 4th time this week that machine had trespassed over my land, and I was running out of patience. And hey, at first I thought it was just some punk kid in the neighborhood experimenting with new tech. But when I followed its path, it drifted straight toward the white-painted, obnoxiously pristine roof of Karen's house. That's when I knew. Karen, and her self-appointed role as the queen of the HOA, had already made life difficult for everyone within shouting distance. But now she'd crossed into airspace she didn't belong in. I whistled for Buck, my dog, who looked up at the drone like he wanted to bite it clean out of the sky. I had half a mind to grab my shotgun and the other half to take a deep breath and wait, but just barely. I hopped in my truck and headed straight for Karen's place. By the time I got there, she was already outside watering a row of plastic flowers and pretending she didn't hear the gravel crunching under my tires. I stepped out and walked up slow, giving her the benefit of the doubt for about 3 seconds. I asked her nicely what the drone was for, why it was flying over my land, and when she planned to stop. She didn't answer right away, just smirked and said something about community safety and visual inspections. I reminded her that I wasn't in her HOA jurisdiction. She responded like a snake in pearls, calm and condescending, telling me the HOA had expanded oversight privileges. I didn't know whether to laugh or argue, so I just stared at her, stunned by the boldness. Then she patted the remote control she had hanging from her wrist like a designer purse and told me the drone would now be making routine passes to ensure visual compliance. Whatever that meant, it sounded like trouble wrapped in nonsense. I didn't sleep much that night. The buzzing came again around midnight. It hovered near my back porch, just out of reach, watching. I grabbed a flashlight and shined it on the drone, but it didn't flinch. It was like looking into a robot's soulless eye. I waved at it, shouted at it, threw a wrench at it. Nothing worked. It floated there for another 5 minutes before zooming off back to Karen's castle of surveillance. That's when the idea struck me, not just to stop her drone, but to make sure she'd never fly it over my land again. Let me know if you want to continue the story from here. This could turn into a real showdown. Never flew one near me again. The next morning, I poured myself a thick cup of black coffee and sat on the porch with a pad and pen. I started sketching out an idea, something aerial, something that could chase the drone, disrupt it, block it, maybe even neutralize it. I'd need precision, altitude, and just the right timing. I thought about the tools I had, my old tractor, a few nets, maybe a slingshot, but none of it felt right. Then I remembered something better. My buddy Dave. Dave was a crop duster, and he owed me a favor. A big one. Back in the day, I bailed him out when he nearly ran his plane into a windmill, and he promised I could call on him for anything. Well, this was definitely anything. I called Dave and told him I needed his old plane, not for spraying crops, but for something more creative. He laughed, called me crazy, and then said he'd meet me at the small rural airstrip on the edge of town the next day. I spent the rest of that afternoon watching Karen's drone make its predictable loop around my ranch. I recorded its route, flight time, and altitude. I treated it like it was an invading pest that needed exterminating. In a way, it was. When I got to the airstrip the next morning, Dave was already there, leaning against the wing of his bright yellow crop duster like he was posing for a postcard. I explained the plan, and he nearly fell over laughing. But after I showed him the footage and told him about Karen's little threats, he got serious. He said I could borrow the plane for a few hours, but if I crashed it or got caught, he'd swear he never heard of me. That was fine. I didn't plan on crashing, and as far as getting caught went, well, I had my own set of cameras watching every inch of my ranch, just like Karen. The only difference was, mine were legal. I spent the next few hours practicing on an open field just beyond the canyon, flying low, angling the sprayer, checking the reach and pattern of the nozzles. I didn't load it with chemicals. Instead, I mixed up a harmless but thick and sticky blend of molasses, water, and just a touch of food dye for good measure. It wouldn't damage electronics, but it would coat anything it touched in a gummy mess that would take hours to clean. By the time I got back home, the drone was up again. It floated near the barn, dipping low over my chickens, who scattered like they'd seen a hawk. I watched it from the roof, chewing on a piece of jerky and waiting. I had a feeling tomorrow would be the last time Karen flew it. Let me know if you'd like to continue. This is shaping up to be quite the showdown. You said, anything over my land, she wanted to spy. She won. Anything over my land, she wanted to spy. She wanted control. But she forgot the most important part about living out here. Respect goes both ways, and she was about to get sprayed with a lesson in boundaries. The next morning came with a heavy sky, and the kind of stillness that usually meant trouble was waking up early. I sat at the edge of my porch, sipping black coffee again, watching the drone make its way across the ridge like clockwork. It was always at the same time, always the same lazy pattern. Karen wasn't even trying to hide the fact that she'd turned it into her personal airborne watchdog. It dipped low over the chicken coop, circled the pond, and buzzed right over my bedroom window. At this point, it felt less like surveillance and more like provocation. What made it worse was how she acted like it was all just part of some big neighborhood favor. I'd overheard her telling one of the new HOA members that the drone was providing free ranch security for the community. The only thing it was securing was her control over people who were too polite or too tired to stand up to her nonsense. Not me. I wasn't part of her little HOA empire, and I sure wasn't going to let her fly a camera over my livestock like I was running a black market. Around midday, I drove out to the edge of town, where the crop duster was parked under a sheet metal roof, waiting like a sleeping dragon. Dave met me there, leaning on the wing with his usual half grin and a sandwich in one hand. He handed me the keys without much small talk and reminded me to keep it low, keep it legal, and try not to make the news. I loaded the tank with the molasses mix and ran one final check. Everything was in place. The altitude gauge was working, sprayer nozzles were clear, and the fuel was topped off. I wasn't nervous. I was focused. I hadn't felt this focus since the time I had to deliver a calf in the middle of a thunderstorm with nothing but a flashlight and my belt to pull with. As I climbed into the cockpit, I could already hear the faint buzzing of the drone in the distance. It was right on schedule. I started the engine, let it hum and rumble, then rolled out slow onto the dirt runway. The wheels kicked up dust behind me like a signal to the sky that I was coming. I lifted off steady, then banked left toward my own land. I kept low, hugging the terrain, and waited until I saw the glint of the drone hovering over the cattle pasture. It was perfectly still, as if it knew something was coming but couldn't quite figure out what. I circled wide, checked my altitude, then lined up the spray nozzles. The drone floated a few feet above the field, its little red light blinking like a heart monitor. I flew over once without releasing anything just to get my angle right. On the second pass, I let the mixture go. The sprayer hissed, and a sticky mist rained down directly over the drone. For a split second, it hovered in confusion, its blades twitching. Then the propeller started to lag, gummed up with sugar and molasses. Let me know if you'd like to continue. Things are getting interesting with this aerial showdown. The weight jerked it sideways, spun once, then dropped like a rock straight into my irrigation pond. I couldn't help it. I laughed loud and long. It was like watching a wasp fall into a glass of lemonade. I looped around once more just for fun, then turned back toward the airstrip, feeling like I'd just flown the dumbest, most satisfying mission of my life. When I landed, Dave was waiting with his arms crossed and a grin stretched across his face, so wide it looked painful. He didn't even ask if it worked. He just slapped the side of the plane and said, "That'll teach her." By the time I got back to the ranch, Karen was already there. Her car was parked crooked across my driveway, and she was pacing back and forth like a caged animal. I stepped out of the truck slow, wiping my hands on a rag and pretending I hadn't been 30 feet above her surveillance toy just an hour earlier. She stormed up to me, holding the waterlogged drone in her hands like it was a dead bird. She shouted about criminal damage and federal charges, and how she was going to report me to every agency from the local sheriff to Homeland Security. I stayed quiet, and let her rant. When she paused to breathe, I calmly asked what her drone was doing over private land in the first place. She dodged the question like a politician and waved a soggy manual in my face, claiming it had a license and that I had obstructed official HOA observation duties. I didn't bother arguing. Instead, I told her I had barn camera footage of her drone harassing my animals and flying below the safe altitude limit. I also reminded her that flying over non-HOA land without permission was a violation of several local and federal codes, including one that dealt with unauthorized recording. Her expression changed just enough for me to see the flicker of panic behind her eyes. She wasn't used to someone pushing back. Later that afternoon, I drove into town to drop off the footage at the sheriff's office, just in case she really did try to press charges. The sheriff watched the clip twice, then leaned back in his chair and shook his head. He said Karen had been towing the legal line for years, but had finally stepped over it. He promised to have a talk with her and make it official, no more drones over private property. I thanked him and walked out, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. Back home, the animals were calm, the air was still, and there wasn't a single buzz in the sky. I sat on the porch again, this time with a glass of sweet tea, watching the sun slip behind the hills. No cameras, no engines, no HOA queen on her throne of nonsense, just peace. Real, earned peace. But I knew Karen. She wasn't the type to give up with just one loss. She'd be back, probably bigger, probably louder. But next time, I'd be ready. The calm didn't last. Not even 3 days. Just when I thought the sky above my ranch was mine again, I caught sight of a shadow flickering over the pasture. At first, I thought it was a hawk, maybe an early-season kestrel. But when I looked up, I saw something much worse. A new drone, bigger than before, with more propellers and a sleeker body. This one didn't hover aimlessly or wobble in the wind. It moved with purpose, like a predator circling its prey. I stood there under the open sky, fists clenched, watching it zip over my barn with military precision. Karen hadn't just replaced the drone. She'd, "Let me know if you'd like to continue or need anything else. Things are escalating quickly now." Grounded. She'd upgraded. This time it had a longer range and was equipped with thermal imaging. I could see the red tint of its lens even from the ground, scanning for movement. I wasn't even in my field at the time. I was standing behind the barn near the feed troughs, yet somehow the drone managed to find me. It paused over my head like it was mocking me. I threw my hat at it just to feel like I was doing something, but it floated higher, out of reach. Out of defiance. I didn't even bother driving to Karen's house this time. I knew it wouldn't help. She'd just smile, tell me to talk to the HOA board, then make some snide remark about how rural folk are so paranoid. But this time, I wasn't just irritated. I was done playing. This wasn't a game anymore. This was harassment dressed up like neighborhood security, and I wasn't about to let her win by sending in a more advanced machine while pretending she was within her rights. I needed to outthink her. Using the crop duster again would be obvious. I'd shown my hand with that move already. She probably figured I wouldn't risk damaging the new one, and she might have been right if I was thinking about spraying it again. But I wasn't. This time, I was going to make her expose herself. I needed to get her so comfortable, so confident, that she'd fly that drone low enough to break more than one rule. And once she did, I'd have everything I needed to end this once and for all. I got to work setting up a decoy scene near the barn, where the drone had been hovering most. I staged a few props, a large wooden crate with spray-painted warnings like "Hazard" and "Keep Out" placed beside an old rusty tank I dragged out from the shed. I added a mannequin with a floppy hat and work boots, rigged to move on a pulley system. From a distance, it looked like someone sneaking around, doing something suspicious from the air. It was perfect bait. I even placed a few large containers marked with stickers to suggest they held illegal fertilizer or restricted chemicals. Then I turned my attention to what really mattered: documentation. I mounted a high-definition camera under the porch roof, aimed directly at the barn, and another camouflaged inside an old owl box up on a tree. Both had wide views and zoom capabilities. If Karen wanted footage, then so did I. But unlike her, mine would be legal, time-stamped, and ready to hand over to the right authorities. The next evening, Just after sunset, the drone returned. I was already on the porch, pretending to whittle a stick, but really I was watching the live feed on my tablet. The drone circled a bit higher than before, then slowly lowered itself near the barn. The dummy twitched slightly in the wind, and the drone hesitated. Then, as if curiosity outweighed caution, it dropped even lower, scanning the fake setup with its red lens glowing brighter in the dim light. I had never seen a machine act so nosy in my life. It hovered over the dummy, drifted toward the crate, and tilted sideways, clearly focusing on the tank I'd placed as bait. It stayed like that for almost a full minute. That was all I needed. The camera under the porch caught every second of it. The one in the tree got a perfect wide-angle view, showing the drone crossing well over the fence line and hanging directly above my property. The height was low enough that I could have knocked it out with a broom if I'd wanted to. Let me know if you'd like to continue the story. Things are getting tense, and you're setting up quite the trap. But I didn't. I wanted it to keep recording, keep trespassing, keep proving exactly how far Karen was willing to go. The next morning, I drove into town and paid a visit to the FAA liaison office. A small town like ours didn't have much federal presence, but we had a designated contact for airspace complaints, especially with the increase in drone usage near ranches and airstrips. I brought my footage, printed screenshots, timestamp logs, and even a short write-up of all previous drone encounters. The man behind the counter watched in silence, then asked if the operator had any form of registration or authorization to be flying that low near private livestock. I told him no. His expression didn't change much, but he nodded slowly and told me someone would be following up within the week. And just like that, the wheels were turning. Karen had overplayed her hand. She thought because no one had stopped her yet, no one would. But she'd underestimated how quiet country folk fight. We don't yell. We gather evidence. We don't bark, we build traps. And we don't strike fast, we wait until the landing is soft and the fall is long. That same afternoon, a few neighbors dropped by, curious about all the strange activity around my barn. I told them what was going on, showed them the fake setup, and then showed them the footage. One by one, their jaws dropped. Turns out, I wasn't the only one being watched. A woman down the road said the drone followed her to her back porch while she was out in her robe. Another said it spooked his goats, causing one to break its leg jumping the fence. We stood around the crate like it was a town hall meeting, and before long, someone suggested we write up a petition, not just about Karen but about the HOA, about boundaries, about privacy. By sundown, we had 20 names on a single sheet of paper, and it wasn't even circulated beyond our dirt road. Something had shifted. People were tired of her power grabs, her drones, her rules, and her fake authority. And now, with proof in hand and an official complaint filed, she wouldn't be able to hide behind her title much longer. The sky had always been big, blue, and free out here, but Karen forgot that freedom swings both ways. And now, she was about to learn just how heavy it can hit when you keep poking at people who are just trying to be left alone. The next few days passed like the quiet before a storm. The drone was gone, and for a moment, it almost felt like Karen had finally gotten the message. But deep down, I knew her kind didn't just back down. They regrouped. They reloaded. And sure enough, just as the sun dipped past the hills on a cool Thursday evening, I spotted her standing at the edge of my property. She wasn't alone. She had a new remote in her hands, sleek and shiny, and beside her on the grass was something that looked less like a drone and more like a miniature helicopter. It was bigger, faster, and meaner looking than anything I'd seen buzzing through my skies before. She didn't even try to hide it. She flew it up with a flick of her wrist, and it bolted straight into the air like a bird of prey. This one didn't just hover, it roared. And as it climbed above the treeline, its camera lens swiveled downward, tracking everything that moved below. It swept over my barn, hovered over my pond, and made slow, deliberate loops around the feed shed. I could feel it watching me even when I couldn't see it. It wasn't surveillance anymore, it was a threat. Karen stood there, watching her machine like it was some kind of pet she'd trained to hunt. She waved at me, not with a smile, but with smug satisfaction, as if daring me to try and stop her again. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept checking the monitor connected to my barn cams, expecting to see the drone come back with its thermal lens peeking through the darkness. Around 2 in the morning, I finally saw it, just a faint outline in the corner of the feed lot, drifting silently in a low, circling pattern. It hovered near the crate I'd left out, zoomed in, and then bolted off into the sky like, hey, let me know if you'd like to continue the story. It's getting pretty intense now.
Ghost.
I shut off the monitor and leaned back in my chair. I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I contacted the FAA representative again and gave him the update. He sounded more interested this time, especially when I described the size of the new drone and the night flight patterns. He asked if I had video proof. I said I had more than proof, I had a show reel. I offered to send everything and followed up with time-stamped footage that clearly showed the drone dipping well below legal flight ceilings, hovering over livestock at night, and crossing into restricted airspace near the crop fields where low-flying manned aircraft operated regularly. It was enough to raise serious questions, and from the tone in his voice, I could tell the matter had just moved from a mild complaint to something worth investigating. Then came the break I didn't expect. A retired Air Force mechanic named Bill, who lived 3 properties over, stopped by to drop off eggs and mentioned something strange. He'd seen the drone at the hardware store in town a few weeks back and remembered it because of how unusual and powerful it looked. He said the guy at the counter told him Karen had special ordered it online and boasted about it having features that weren't even available commercially yet. I asked him if he'd be willing to talk to someone about it. Bill just grinned and said he hadn't had this much fun since his base commander's car got filled with fire ants as a prank. Within 48 hours, 2 men in collared shirts showed up at my property. They weren't in uniform, but they carried badges and asked all the right questions. They'd been sent by the regional FAA enforcement office after my report had been escalated. I showed them everything, every file, every recording, every neighbor statement I had.
Gathered.
They were especially interested in the footage showing the drone operating at night and hovering below 100 feet near my cattle pen. They thanked me, told me not to engage, and said they'd handle it.
I didn't ask how.
2 days later, Karen received a visit. It wasn't subtle. 2 marked vehicles and a 3rd unmarked sedan parked outside her house, and within 20 minutes, they were walking out with a case that looked suspiciously like the one she'd used to carry her new drone. She was red-faced and furious, yelling into her phone, pacing back and forth on her front lawn while the agents calmly loaded everything into their cars. I watched it all from my porch. Didn't even bother pretending to look away. She glanced over at me once. I lifted my coffee in salute and went back to sipping. But she wasn't done yet. Karen never knew how to quit while she was behind. A few days after the FAA visit, she tried to turn the tables again. She called for an emergency HOA meeting and tried to introduce a new bylaw proposal, one that would allow the HOA to enforce observational coverage on neighboring properties deemed potential hazards to the community. It was a mouthful of fake authority wrapped in paranoia, but this time, the neighbors weren't buying it. Word had spread fast. The drone footage had made the rounds in group chats and backyard conversations. People weren't afraid of Karen anymore. They were angry. The vote wasn't even close. Every single member at the meeting voted down her proposal. Some didn't even let her finish reading it. One neighbor, a quiet woman named Marcy who usually kept to herself, stood up and said she'd had enough of being watched every time she stepped into her garden. Another guy mentioned how his kids were afraid to play in their yard at night because they thought the drone was following them. The meeting ended with Karen storming out, papers clutched in her arms, her heels clacking furiously on the floor like she was trying to break the ground beneath her. By the weekend, a new vote had been scheduled, not just on her proposals on her presidency. The community was tired of her drones, her spying, her threats and rules and self-importance. Flyers went up. People knocked on doors. And for the first time in years, the HOA had an actual turnout for something other than a potluck or a parking violation hearing. I didn't even attend the meeting. I stayed home, grilled a steak, and listened to the cicadas. I didn't need to hear the outcome. I already knew. When my neighbor's truck rolled past my gate and honked twice, I smiled. Karen was out. Not just voted down, voted out completely. And not a single drone in the sky to watch her fall. The morning after the vote, the air on my ranch felt different. It was lighter, clearer, as if the sky itself was relieved to be free of Karen's surveillance. For the first time in weeks, there was no humming overhead, no artificial eyes scanning the land, just the sound of wind brushing through the tall grass, the soft cluck of hens, and the occasional grunt of a lazy hog stretching in the dirt. I poured myself a cup of coffee, walked out to the porch, and took a long look across the property. It was all mine again, not just legally but spiritually. The skies, the soil, the silence, it had all been reclaimed. Karen, meanwhile, had vanished from sight. Her house still stood at the end of the cul-de-sac, but her windows were closed, her front gate locked, and not a single car had been parked in her driveway since the day she was removed as HOA president. Rumor had it she was in talks to sell the place and move somewhere with tighter rules and more cameras. One neighbor said she had listed her house on a gated community site. Another claimed she was calling around, trying to find legal grounds to sue the HOA board for betrayal. Nobody knew for sure, and honestly, nobody cared. Everyone had moved on. Even the birds seemed to fly freer above the neighborhood. That afternoon, I took a walk along the fence line with Buck trotting ahead, sniffing at fence posts and pausing now and then to roll in something foul. The barn stood quiet. The field, steady. The dummy I had set up during my trap days was still slumped near the shed, half forgotten but somehow comforting in its worn flannel and straw-stuffed boots. I figured I would leave it a little longer, just in case Karen had one last drone hidden in her basement, waiting for a dramatic comeback. But deep down, I knew she was finished. Later that week, the sheriff dropped by. He wasn't in uniform, just wearing his Saturday flannel and carrying a six-pack of root beer and a grin. We sat on the porch, watching the sunset melt across the hills like butter, and laughed about the whole mess. He said the FAA had officially closed their case, confirming that Karen's drone flights had broken several regulations. They were issuing fines and had even flagged her account with a warning. He also mentioned that a few more neighbors had submitted evidence of her old drones spying through windows and over backyards, which would likely lead to more legal headaches for her down the road. I asked if I was clear, and he gave me a look like I had just asked if water was wet. He said not only was I in the clear, but I might have set a new local precedent for how to deal with airspace violations. He joked about nominating me for a town award, Defender of the Skies, or something equally ridiculous. We both laughed, the kind of laugh that comes easy when peace has returned and the sky belongs to the birds again. A medal, or maybe getting the county to name my pasture a no-fly zone. That's what the sheriff joked about. I told him all I really wanted was to put up a sign that read, "Try me again and find out." The next day, I found myself itching to take to the sky one last time.
Not to fight or chase anything.
Just to fly. I called up Dave and asked if the crop duster was still sitting out at the strip. He told me the tank was empty and the keys were waiting. I drove out early, just before the heat set in, and climbed back into that dusty cockpit. The engine sputtered, growled, then settled into a low purr, like a dog curling up by the fire. I didn't load it with anything sticky this time. Just a sack of wildflower seeds and some dry fertilizer. Something peaceful, for once. I flew low over the ranch, circling slowly, watching as the field stretched out below me like a quiet painting. When I hit the ridge above the pond, I opened the chute and let the seeds fall. Tiny flecks of green and blue and yellow fluttered down, carried by the breeze, scattering across the soil like confetti at a wedding. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about growth, about reclaiming something that had been disturbed. I made one last pass, waved to an old neighbor down on the road, then banked toward the strip and landed soft. When I got back to the house, I found a note taped to my door. It was handwritten, no name, just a short message that said, "Thank you for standing up for all of us. We thought we were alone until you showed us we weren't." It wasn't signed, but I didn't need it to be. The handwriting was shaky but neat, the kind that probably came from someone older who had finally found the courage to speak up. I folded the note and tucked it inside the drawer next to my coffee mug. The days that followed were quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you realize just how loud things had gotten without you noticing. The neighborhood started to shift. People who never waved before were stopping by to talk. A few offered eggs or pie. Someone dropped off extra hay bales with a scribbled note that said, *, just because. *. There was a sense of peace. A return to the way things were supposed to be, before rules became weapons and authority became a spotlight. One evening, as the sky turned soft and gold, I took Buck out for one more walk. We reached the top of the hill and sat there in the tall grass, just the two of us. I looked out at my ranch, the same land I'd walked 1,000 times, but now it felt somehow more mine than ever. Not because I'd fought for it, but because I defended it. Against noise. Against invasion. Against control that never belonged here in the first place. As the stars blinked to life above us, I heard nothing but the sounds of crickets and wind. No hum. No buzz. No watching eyes.
Just stillness.
Just freedom. And that was all I ever needed.